Discipline in Agamemnon's army is slowly disappearing, like water seeping into the sand. Kings don't trust each other, allies seek ways to return to their own lands. The same question echoes in everyone's mind. What was all this destruction for? For a woman, or for the insatiable ego of an ambitious king? The Achaeans are weary. The Achaeans are hopeless. Bronze shields are riddled with scratches, swords blunted from 10 years of fighting. But what is most blunted is the desire in the hearts of the people to return. This is not just the story of a city's siege, but the story of a civilization's demise within its own borders. In the darkness of the 10th year, as the Achaean camp falls silent, only the distant hooting of an owl and the unquenchable fires burning atop the walls of Troy remain. Everyone knows that if things don't change, this shore will be their final resting place. Close your eyes again and sink into that heavy, mournful atmosphere. Tonight, a silence as heavy as lead hangs over the Achaean camp, a silence unlike any other night in the 10-year war. This silence heralds not just a defeat, but the end of an era. The darkness that descends upon the army has a name. Achilles is gone. The leader of the Myrmidons, the legendary warrior whose semi-divine strength shook the walls of Troy and whose sword guided destiny, has fallen into the cold embrace of the earth. The most sorrowful lines in the archives record his death not merely as the loss of a soldier, but as the tearing away of the very soul of the Achaean army. For days he hasn't spoken to anyone. His eyes are distant, his gaze seemingly wandering not in this world, but on the maps of a future that doesn't yet exist. The other kings mistake his state for a loss of reason or a deep melancholy. Yet Odysseus is dissecting the massive walls of Troy, stone by stone, in his mind. He believes that what brute force, bronze swords, and thousands of soldiers couldn't accomplish, a thought could. Odysseus knows that Troy is not just a fortress of stone. It stands on the beliefs, fears, and traditions of the people within. If the walls cannot be destroyed from the outside, the only way to infiltrate is not by breaking the stones, but by deceiving the spirits. Thousands of scenarios clash in his mind. Should a spy be sent? Should a secret tunnel be dug? Or should the army truly retreat? Each idea piles on top of the previous one, but none fills that perfect void. Odysseus's silence is like an artist gazing at a blank canvas. There is nothing there yet, but he can see everything. His silence is more effective than Agamemnon's cries, for within that silence, the first atoms of the brilliant plan that will bring an end to a 10-year war are colliding. He waits with the patience of a chess master, not a warrior. He does not take his eyes off Troy for a single moment, for he knows that every giant has a weak point, and that point is sometimes as concrete as a sword stroke, sometimes as abstract as a whisper. As the night progresses, the air around Odysseus grows heavier. As the wind whips his cloak, he listens only to the sound of the sea. Poseidon's waves seem to whisper something to him. An idea, an image, an indistinct shape appears and disappears on the shores of his mind. This silence is the incubation period of that great deception that will determine the fate of a civilization. While Odysseus is lost in his own silence, he is actually plotting the end of Troy. The weariness of 10 years, the death of Achilles, the ineptitude of kings, all are fueled within this silence. Now only that single moment of inspiration is needed. When that moment arrives, the silence will give way not to the cry of history's greatest military genius, but to the infamous hooves of that slyly smiling horse. But for now, there is only the night, the sea, and the deep, dark, terrifying silence of a man. Imagine the night and that endless darkness. The noise of the Achaean camp is now far behind. Neither the endless arguments in Agamemnon's tent nor the hushed groans of the soldiers awaiting death reach here. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, stands alone on the wet sand where the sea meets the land. The night is cold and ominous, like the waters of the Aegean. In the sky, the moon casts a faint light over the high towers of Troy, but below, in the darkness of the shore, Odysseus is alone with the storm within himself. In the archive's Ancient Solitudes section, this moment is described as the moment a man begins not to speak with the gods, but to listen to them. The waves crashing beneath Odysseus's feet seem to tell the story of millennia. He is not just a king, he is a sailor who knows the spirit of the sea. Tonight, the rhythmic sound of the sea offers him not solace, but guidance. He gazes at the dark horizon, looking into Poseidon's dark waters. Odysseus knows that if this siege is to end in any way, it will only be through the grace of the sea and the gods and the boundless wisdom of man. He looks at the foam washing ashore, at the tracks left by the receding sea. A single question echoes in his mind. For 10 years we have tried. For 10 years we have sacrificed everything. O Poseidon, O wise Athena, do these walls have no language? What lie do you want us to tell? As the wind descends from Mount Ida like a cool breath, Odysseus's cloak billows fiercely. In this moment of solitude, he begins to think not just like a warrior, but like a philosopher. The truth that war cannot be won by brute force takes root in his mind, just as the sea beats against the rocks, but never overcomes them. Water conquers not by beating the rock, but by seeping, eroding it over time, or finding a gap and entering. As Odysseus walks along the shore at night, his eyes fall upon the enormous pieces of wood, shipwrecks, and uprooted tree trunks washed ashore by the sea. These piles of wood form strange, colossal shapes in the darkness. At that moment, a flash of insight strikes him, but it is not yet a complete idea, only an image, a feeling. They must build something gigantic, something noble enough to appear as a farewell gift and profound enough to conceal death. Walking alone on the sands of the beach, Odysseus's steps were now more determined. On this night, he did not merely seek an answer, he gave birth to the dark art that would end the war, the art of deception. The silence of the night became his teacher. The boundless patience of the sea taught him not to rush, but to plan flawlessly. The torches atop the walls of Troy may still burn, but on this night, the idea that would bring those walls down began to take shape in a man's mind. Before dawn, Odysseus looks at the sea one last time and makes the decision that remains unspoken but echoes throughout the universe. If the gods did not make us fight and win like lions, we will sneak in like foxes. This silent revolution on the night shore is the birth pangs of the great inspiration that would forever change the course of history. Close your eyes and imagine the cold, dew-covered silence of dawn. While the Achaean camp was still in the deepest stage of sleep, Odysseus stood still on the shore, at the boundary where the sand ended and the rocks rose. As the sun rose faintly behind the walls of Troy, its light illuminated the war wreckage scattered along the beach. Odysseus's eyes fell upon something he had trampled over all night, a massive, ancient ship's keel and broken planks piled ashore like a breakwater. In the hazy morning light, this pile of wood resembled the enormous, lifeless skeleton of an animal lying on the sand. At that moment, all the pieces of his mind came together. The eureka moment he had awaited for 10 years was embodied in these pieces of wood washed ashore by the sea.
In the peaceful silence, feel this revolutionary idea enveloping Odysseus's entire being. His weariness vanished instantly, his sleep-deprived red eyes beginning to gleam. This man standing beside the breakwater on the shore was no longer just a king, but the creator of the great art that would change the course of history. Although dawn was over, an eternal darkness was about to begin for Troy. Odysseus turns and begins to walk towards the camp. His steps no longer crush the sand. It is as if he is walking on the future. This inspiration is more real than the whispers of the gods. It is the most brilliant and darkest masterpiece born of human ingenuity. Now all he has to do is transform this abstract idea into tangible wood and flesh. Close your eyes and imagine the dim, incense-scented silence in Odysseus's tent. After that great moment of enlightenment on the shore, his exhausted body has finally succumbed to sleep. But this is no ordinary rest. It is that mystical interval where the mind breaks free from its earthly bonds and meets the wisdom of Olympus. In the archive's Divine Interventions section, this moment is described as the sacred second when wisdom touches strategy. In his dream, Odysseus finds himself in the middle of a vast olive grove. As the wind painted the olive leaves a silvery hue, a woman appeared before him, her armor gleaming, her eyes as sharp as an owl's. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and military strategy. The waves crashing beneath Odysseus's feet seemed to tell the story of millennia. He is not just a king, he is a sailor who knows the spirit of the sea. Tonight, the rhythmic sound of the sea offers him not solace, but guidance. He gazes at the dark horizon, looking into Poseidon's dark waters. Odysseus knows that if this siege is to end in any way, it will only be through the grace of the sea and the gods and the boundless wisdom of man. He looks at the foam washing ashore, at the tracks left by the receding sea. A single question echoes in his mind. For 10 years we have tried. For 10 years we have sacrificed everything. O Poseidon, O wise Athena, do these walls have no language? What lie do you want us to tell? As the wind descends from Mount Ida like a cool breath, Odysseus's cloak billows fiercely. In this moment of solitude, he begins to think not just like a warrior, but like a philosopher. The truth that war cannot be won by brute force takes root in his mind, just as the sea beats against the rocks, but never overcomes them. Water conquers not by beating the rock, but by seeping, eroding it over time, or finding a gap and entering. As Odysseus walks along the shore at night, his eyes fall upon the enormous pieces of wood, shipwrecks, and uprooted tree trunks washed ashore by the sea. These piles of wood form strange, colossal shapes in the darkness. At that moment, a flash of insight strikes him, but it is not yet a complete idea, only an image, a feeling. They must build something gigantic, something noble enough to appear as a farewell gift and profound enough to conceal death.
Walking alone on the sands of the beach, Odysseus's steps were now more determined. On this night, he did not merely seek an answer, he gave birth to the dark art that would end the war, the art of deception. The silence of the night became his teacher. The boundless patience of the sea taught him not to rush, but to plan flawlessly. The torches atop the walls of Troy may still burn, but on this night, the idea that would bring those walls down began to take shape in a man's mind. Before dawn, Odysseus looks at the sea one last time and makes the decision that remains unspoken but echoes throughout the universe. If the gods did not make us fight and win like lions, we will sneak in like foxes. This silent revolution on the night shore is the birth pangs of the great inspiration that would forever change the course of history. Close your eyes and imagine the cold, dew-covered silence of dawn. While the Achaean camp was still in the deepest stage of sleep, Odysseus stood still on the shore, at the boundary where the sand ended and the rocks rose. As the sun rose faintly behind the walls of Troy, its light illuminated the war wreckage scattered along the beach. Odysseus's eyes fell upon something he had trampled over all night, a massive, ancient ship's keel and broken planks piled ashore like a breakwater. In the hazy morning light, this pile of wood resembled the enormous, lifeless skeleton of an animal lying on the sand. At that moment, all the pieces of his mind came together. The eureka moment he had awaited for 10 years was embodied in these pieces of wood washed ashore by the sea.
Athena approaches Odysseus not with the anger of a warrior, but with the calmness of a master. The goddess does not speak. Her voice flows directly into Odysseus's mind like the wind through the leaves. He thrusts the spear in his hand into the ground, and a huge, shining horse figure rises from the ground, reaching up to the sky. Athena clarifies the blurry plan in Odysseus's mind with her famous whisper. The Trojans consider horses sacred, Odysseus. For them, the horse is the gift of Poseidon, the lord of the seas, and the sign of freedom. A ram hitting a wall breeds hatred, but an offering left at the door breeds curiosity and loyalty. Give them not a reason to fight, but an excuse to worship. This dream is not just an image, it is the completion of the missing spirit of the plan. Athena imprints not only the shape, but also the details of the horse into Odysseus's mind. The horse's eyes should look in such a way that the Trojan looking at it should see divine sorrow in it. Its body should stand so upright that those within the walls should feel the pride of owning it. The goddess whispers the greatest secret to Odysseus. If you want to defeat your enemy, turn the greatest love in his heart into a weapon against him. The Trojans' deep, unshakable passion for horses will be their executioner. Athena's whisper transforms the idea of raw wood in Odysseus's mind into a finely crafted psychological operation. When Odysseus wakes up covered in sweat, the sunlight penetrating into his tent hits his armor. But he no longer cares about the difference between dream and reality. The goddess gave him not just a plan, but an approval. That restless weight inside him is gone, replaced by a cold and calculated determination. Athena's presence in the dream sealed the following truth to Odysseus. This war will not end with the sword. It will end with a game of faith. When he comes out of his tent, his eyes are no longer looking at the piles of wood on the beach, but as if they are looking at that huge imaginary horse still standing in the sky. There is no turning back now. Divine inspiration combined with human genius, and the fate of Troy was sealed in the whisper of a goddess that morning. Close your eyes and imagine that tense weight. The air inside the tent is heavy with the dust of 10 years of war and the harsh breath of the kings inside. Around the table were lined up men who were legends in their own land: the proud Agamemnon, the ambitious Menelaus, the old and wise Nestor, the angry Diomedes, and others. They all have that deep, dark shadow on their faces that comes from the loss of Achilles and the endless failure. Only one voice is heard in the council, Agamemnon hitting the table with his fist. The discussions go nowhere. Everyone blames each other. The voices of those who talk about burning the ships and returning are getting louder. In the midst of this chaos, Odysseus, who has been silent for days, stands up. Suddenly, the eerie silence that occurs before a storm prevails in the tent.
When Odysseus leans over the table and puts his finger right in front of the impenetrable walls of Troy, the icy clarity in his gaze silences everyone. When he begins to speak, his voice is low, but every word is as sharp as a sword blow. We have been beating these walls for 10 years, and for 10 years we have only learned to die, because we are trying to tear down the stones of Troy, but what we really need to destroy is their minds. While the kings look at each other in surprise, Odysseus begins to explain his crazy plan: a huge wooden horse, a coffin where the most elite warriors are hidden, the retreat of the army, the ships hiding behind the island of Tenedos, and the huge fake offering to be left at the gates of Troy. As Odysseus details the plan, a wave of surprise, then cynicism spreads through the tent. Diomedes starts laughing. Menelaus frowns angrily. Agamemnon is astonished. "What are you talking about, Odysseus? Are we going to overthrow a huge empire with a child's toy? Is the solution you brought us at the end of 10 years a carpentry job? Are you crazy?" he thunders. This moment is the greatest mind and brute force conflict in history. In the most strategic pages of the archive, this presentation was noted as the first great resistance of muscle power against intelligence. To fight for kings, to fight shield to shield, is to die honorably or to be killed. Hiding, cheating, and hiding inside a statue seem like an affront to their heroic code.
But Odysseus doesn't back down. He fixes his gaze on Agamemnon's eyes and asks the crucial question: will you continue to die here for another 10 years, or will you sleep inside Troy tonight? This question instantly shatters all the air of pride in the tent. Odysseus explains that the plan isn't just about a horse, but a psychological bomb targeting the Trojans' religious beliefs, their passion for horses, and their euphoria of victory. He tells them they will give them not a target to fight with, but a trophy to flatter their pride. The discussion lasts for hours. The kings begin to understand that this idea is both brilliant and terrifyingly risky. Either everything will end, or the Achaean army will be cast into the seas as the greatest mockery in history. What Odysseus offers is not just a wooden horse, it is the final and most brilliant gamble, born of desperation at the end of 10 years. As the wind outside the tent whips their cloaks, the kings inside begin to surrender not their swords, but their minds to the sharpness of this plan for the first time. Close your eyes and imagine the heavy, sweet scent of incense hanging in the air. Away from the fierce debates and angry shouts of the kings in the council tent, a figure stands in the shadows. This is Calchas, the old prophet, whose gaze transcends worldly ambitions, reading the fate of the Achaean army from the tongues of the gods. For the Achaean army, Calchas is not merely a priest, he is one of history's most unsettling observers, able to read the direction of the wind, the flight of birds, and the hidden maps in the livers of sacrificed animals. While Odysseus's unthinkable plan has unleashed a storm among the kings, now all eyes are on this silent old man. For in these lands the sword speaks, but the gods seal the final word. Calchas kneels before the altar, tracing indistinct shapes on the ashes with his fingers. In the archives section, titled "The Voice of Fate," this moment is described as confirmation from the unseen, where the material world ends. Agamemnon and Odysseus wait silently behind the oracle. Suddenly, Calchas raises his head to the sky. His eyes are gleaming as if he sees not only the night, but also beyond time. His voice echoes as if coming from the depths of a cave.
For 10 years the gods have accepted your sacrifices, but withheld victory. For you know how to knock on the door, but do not understand the tongue in the lock. Odysseus's mind is like a fabric woven by the fingers of the goddess Athena. This trick is not merely a lie, it is the very end that fate itself has prepared for Troy. As Calchas elaborates on his prophecy, the air around the tent seems to grow heavier. Pointing to the flapping wings of an eagle circling in the sky, the oracle says that the gods see this trick as a sacred game. According to him, this horse will not be merely a work of carpentry, it will become a talisman that will imprison the pride of Troy. The gods, says Calchas, are weary of honest warriors. Now they wish to witness the triumph of wit and cunning. If you do not build this horse, this shore will be your eternal graveyard. But if you follow Odysseus's plan, the walls of Troy will crumble from within with a single breath. These words sweep away the last vestiges of doubt in the council. The approval of an oracle was, at that time, the greatest source of motivation for an army. Feel this meditative moment. Agamemnon's hands cease to tremble. The mocking expression in the king's eyes gives way to that sacred fear felt in the face of fate. Every word that falls from Calchas's lips lends divine legitimacy to Odysseus's plan. It is no longer a matter of trickery, but of fate. The oracle throws one last handful of salt into the fire on the altar, and the flames momentarily turn a bright green. This is the god's way of saying yes. Calchas arises, leaning on his staff, looks at Odysseus and whispers only this: "Your burden is heavy, Odysseus, for in the belly of this horse will carry not only soldiers, but the end of a decade of history. Begin your preparations." As the night is sealed by this dark but clear prophecy of the oracle, the Achaean army begins to truly smell victory for the first time. But this smell is a strange mixture of freshly cut wood and approaching blood. Close your eyes and imagine the scent of freshly cut wood hanging in the air, the sharp smell of resin. Within the Achaean army are thousands of warriors, thousands of nobles, but more important than all of them at this moment is a name working like a shadow among the tree trunks: Epeios, son of Panopeus. Epeios is not a swordsman or a knight of the lance. He is a craftsman with calloused hands, eyes that gleam with geometry, who understands the language of wood. In the archive's Great Architects section, this moment is described as the second war moved from the sword to the tip of the compass. When Odysseus, accompanied by Agamemnon, entered the smoky and sawdust-filled world of Epeios, the foundations of history's greatest engineering project were being laid. Despite facing kings, Epeios does not lay down his chisel. His loyalty is not to rank, but to the balance of nature. Odysseus, in his deep, calm voice, explains the plan. "You will not make us a statue, Epeios. You will make us a monster. A gigantic horse that will carry 30 warriors in its belly like a womb, that will appear outwardly as noble as a god, but from within will gush death." This demand is both an honor and an impossible burden for an artist. Epeios pauses for a moment, wipes his dirty hands on his apron, and fixes his gaze on the distance, on the walls of Troy. His mind, in that instant, begins to calculate how the wood fibers will interlock, how the center of gravity will be balanced, and how that enormous body will glide on wheels. The notes in the archives state that Epeios, in accepting this task, was not merely obeying, but was consumed by the passion of an artist. He is not just a carpenter, he is the chosen one, whose hands were inspired by Athena. Epeios turns to Odysseus and replies in a low voice, "If you give me the strongest pines of Mount Ida,
If you assign me the best craftsman in your army, I will build you a horse such that when the Trojans see it, they will think they are not looking at a dazzling light, but at a fate embracing their own end. These words guarantee that the project will possess artistic genius beyond its engineering dimension. For Epios, this horse will be the embodiment of all the bitterness of 10 years of war, etched in wood.
Feel this moment. In the silence of the camp, Epeos pulls out a large compass and ruler. He begins to take the first real measurements on the sand. The horse's height must be millimeter precise, just enough to pass through the gate of the city walls. The air vents inside must appear from the outside like the natural grain of the wood. The summoning of Epeos marks the transition from the destruction phase of the war to the construction phase. When the kings went out, Epeos had already decided where the first tree should be cut. That night, the sound of hammers echoing through the camp was no longer for repairing a ship, but for nailing the coffin of an empire. As Epeos looked at the piece of wood in his hand, he began to weave the physical body of history's greatest military feat, and there was no turning back. Close your eyes and imagine the sound of the first axe strike echoing in the cool dawn. While the rest of the Achaean army was still in that decade-long weary slumber, a small, select group of craftsmen and warriors, under the guidance of Odysseus, had established history's most secret construction site in this desolate bay. It was a natural refuge, out of the range of the Trojan scouts, where the sound of the sea's turbulent waves drowned out the axe blows. In the archive's Secret Operations section, this moment is described as the second the destruction of an empire began with the first chip falling to the ground. Epeos stands in the middle of this desolate beach with his measuring instruments, sketching the outline of a colossal skeleton in the sand. This is no longer a dream, it is a physical reality, a fusion of wood, sweat, and willpower. The air is filled with the sharp, refreshing scent of freshly cut wood. At Epeos's instruction, enormous logs are carried to the shore. The beginning of the construction resembles building a ship rather than a building. However, this ship will not sail on the sea, but on the faith of men. As the craftsmen join each plank together, they are not only imbuing the wood with nailing and interlocking techniques, but also, as it were, the dark wit of Odysseus. Epeos checks each joint repeatedly, for this horse's belly must not creak while bearing the weight of 30 heavily armed men, but must silently keep its secret. Absolute silence reigns among the workers. Only the howling of the wind and the sound of wood scraping against wood can be heard. This silence is like an armor protecting the sanctity of the deception about to be carried out. As the construction rises, a colossal shadow begins to form in the middle of the shore. This skeleton, not yet resembling a horse, might to an outsider resemble a siege tower or the hull of a shattered ship. But Epeos and Odysseus see the end of Troy in every bone of that skeleton. As the sweat from the brows of the workers mixes with the salty sand of the shore, the 10 years of frustration of the Achaean army are buried in the foundations of this colossal structure. Each axe blow strikes the wood with Achilles' revenge, Agamemnon's pride, and the soldiers' longing for home. This first stage of construction is the embodiment of patience. Odysseus sits in a corner, watching the construction while chipping a small piece of wood. His gaze is not only on the outer surface of this towering structure, but also on its dark and empty interior, for that void will house the greatest raid in history. Feel this meditative moment. As the sun rises and sets, the construction site moves in a feverish silence. No spy should see this, no whisper should reach the walls of Troy. As Epeos places a massive beam, he knows this is not just construction, but an art of trap-making. The horse's hooves must be firmly planted on the ground, yet flexible enough to glide on wheels. The beginning of construction is the rebirth of hope, but this hope is the shadow of an impending catastrophe for Troy. As the sun sets, the long shadow of the massive skeleton falls upon the sea, a shadow that seems like a rehearsal of the final darkness that will descend upon Troy. With each passing hour, the wood takes on flesh and bone, and Odysseus's dream draws one step closer to reality. Close your eyes and feel the intense, intoxicating scent of resin. This is Mount Ida, known as the home of the gods, where every tree is believed to carry a spirit. The strongest woodcutters of the Achaean army and the craftsmen chosen by Epeos climbed these peaks to find the sacred flesh that would form the horse's body. In the archive's Nature's Testimony section, this moment is described as the sacrifice of a forest for the destruction of a city. The pines of Mount Ida are no ordinary trees. They are colossal columns forged by the wind, hardened by storms, and absorbing the deepest secrets of the earth for centuries. Epeos presses his ear to the trunk of each tree, for the lives of the 30 men who will be sheltered inside that enormous horse depend on the resilience and fortitude of these trees.
At midnight, a select group of warriors gathers before Odysseus's tent. Their faces bear a dark gleam, a mixture of the weariness of 10 years of war and the determination of a final gamble. Odysseus looks into each of their eyes. He seeks not merely courage, he seeks men who can bear the silence like a sacred ritual. "This will not be a battlefield of heroism," Odysseus says, his voice a whisper in the night. "While the Trojans shout victory outside, you will hold your breath. When fear creeps into your hearts, when darkness descends upon you, you will hold each other's hands and be silent. In this task, your greatest weapon is not your sword, but your silence." Imagine the heavy atmosphere during the selection of the volunteers. Some great warriors choose to retreat, preferring to fight thousands in the open, for being confined in darkness is utterly unnatural to a warrior's nature. Yet some hold the honor of being part of this stratagem above all else. Menelaus feels it is his duty to be there for the sake of his own honor. Diomedes, with his fearlessness, defies the darkness. And of course, Neoptolemus agrees to take his place in this dark womb, to finish the work his father Achilles left unfinished. Each chosen name takes its place on the list like a potential victim, while the rest of the camp can only sense the gravity of this selection in the silence. Feel this meditative moment. As the 30 chosen men look at each other, an unspoken oath is sealed between them. They are no longer just soldiers, but bearers of a destiny. As Odysseus shakes each of their hands, he is actually offering them the most difficult battle, the battle with their own minds. Waiting for hours in the darkness, patiently enduring every blow, every sound from the outside world, not knowing whether it is an execution or a miracle. When the selection of the volunteers is complete, the night grows heavier. When these men climb onto the narrow belly of the horse at dawn, they will leave everything earthly behind. They are now silent ghosts about to infiltrate Troy, and this selection is the first major test of the most cold-blooded military operation history has ever seen.
Close your eyes and imagine the breathing of those 30 shadows gathered in that narrow space. These men are not only the strongest of the Achaean army, but also the most mentally unshakable. In the archive's Silent Heroes section, this list is described as 30 souls closest to death among the living. As Odysseus writes these names on the parchment in his hand, each letter carries the responsibility of a life, a kingdom. He himself is at the top of the list, for the intellect that devised this deception must be the first to pay the price for that dark void. Beside him stands King Menelaus of Sparta. For him, it is an honor to end this 10-year bloody story, which began for Helen in the belly of that colossal horse, in sweat and darkness. The other names on the list are the elite warriors who will shake the impenetrable walls of Troy with terror. Diomedes, that fearless hero who defied even the gods on the battlefield, is now so disciplined he holds his breath inside a statue. Young Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, is there to unleash his father's fury and agility from this dark womb onto the streets of Troy. Little Ajax, Sthenelus, and the others, each of them standing shoulder to shoulder in that narrow wooden space, has left behind their ranks and identities, becoming mere shadows. These 30 men are the first true special forces unit in history. For them, sunlight is now a luxury, and the open air a distant memory. Imagine the mood of the chosen 30 that night. As they look at each other, they need no words. The expression in their eyes holds both a farewell and an unwavering determination. When they entered the horse, they took only their lightest and quietest armor and their sharpest daggers. They had wrapped the joints of their armor in pieces of leather to prevent them from clashing, and lined their sword scabbards with felt. This is less a military preparation and more like the preparation for a ritual. Odysseus teaches each of these 30 men a secret sign, a silent touch, so that they can recognize one another in the darkness. Although the horse's belly looks like a statue from the outside, from the inside it is a living organism woven together by the intertwined wills of these 30 men.
Feel this meditative moment. As midnight strikes, this chosen group gazes at the clear sky for the last time. No one knows when or if they will ever see the stars again. They are no longer part of the Achaean army, but the tip of the hidden dagger that will be plunged into the heart of Troy. As Odysseus seals his own name at the end of the list, he senses that these 30 men are not merely warriors, but carry the final gamble of a civilization on their shoulders. Silence is their greatest ally and their most terrifying enemy. 30 men, 30 heartbeats, and a single purpose. When dawn breaks and they climb those wooden steps into the darkness of the horse, history will record them as the chosen ones. But they will be only silent shadows waiting in the darkness. Close your eyes and imagine yourself standing beneath that enormous wooden shadow. The feverish work of the Achaean masters for months has borne fruit. Epeos' dream and Odysseus' ingenuity have now become a tangible, immense, and terrifying reality. What stands before you is not just a statue of a horse, but a marvel of engineering and a machine of death. The horse's head rises proudly towards the sky. Its eyes are so skillfully crafted that when the sun strikes them, they gaze at the walls of Troy with a sorrowful and profound expression, as if alive. In the archive's Masterpieces section, this moment is described as that first second when a lie seemed more real than the truth.
Now feel your hand touching that smoothed Ida pine. The horse's exterior is joined so seamlessly that not a single joint is visible, polished with olive oil and resin. This polish not only makes the horse shine, it also prevents the natural expansion and contraction of the wood, silencing the infamous creaking of the wood that would betray the warriors within. The horse's legs are like colossal columns resting on wheels. But the true horror of this structure lies not in its outward beauty, but in its dark emptiness within. Epeos carved hidden air vents into the horse's body.
From the outside, these holes appear to be natural knots or ornamentation in the wood, but for the 30 men inside, they are the thin lifelines that connect them to life. Imagine those hidden compartments in the horse's belly. Inside, narrow wooden benches for the warriors to sit on, felt-lined compartments to keep weapons from clashing, and the famous rope ladder mechanism to allow them to silently slip out in case of emergency. Everything is done with millimeter precision. Odysseus, with a lantern in hand, enters the horse's belly one last time. The air inside is heavy, filled with the scent of fresh wood and leather. As he walks through that dark space, he checks every joint, every bolt of the horse. The slightest mistake means that this gamble, which could end a decade-long war in a single night, will become the mass grave of the Achaean army.
Feel this meditative moment. As the sun sets, the long shadow of the enormous horse divides the beach in two. The final preparations are complete. On the side of the horse, a false inscription is carved, appealing to the beliefs of Troy, a thank offering from the Achaeans to the goddess Athena on their return home. This inscription is the outermost layer of deception, the sugar on top of the poison. When Odysseus emerges, he looks at Epios and the craftsmen. No one speaks, for this colossal statue has now forged its own language. It is a silent messenger waiting at the gates of Troy. The final preparations concern not only the wood, but also the spirit. The chosen ones of the camp purify themselves one last time before entering this vast darkness. The horse is now ready, magnificent, enormous, and utterly deadly. The only thing missing is those 30 souls who will give their spirit to this giant. Close your eyes and feel the tense silence. The horse is built. The army has rehearsed its retreat. But the plan needs one final piece to work, a sacrifice that will convince the Trojans that this colossal mass of wood is a gift. This person is Sinon, Odysseus's young cousin. Sinon's task is far more difficult than wielding a sword. He will stand alone and unarmed amidst thousands of enraged Trojans, telling the greatest lie in history. In the archive's Deceivers section, this moment is described as proof of how an empire was destroyed by a tongue. Odysseus pulls Sinon aside and explains the lie he is to tell in meticulous detail. The plan is this: the Achaean army will pretend to have escaped by ship. Sinon will be left on the shore as if he were a wounded fugitive who had escaped being sacrificed by his own comrades. When the Trojans come out in the morning, they will find him and interrogate him. Sinon's task is to tell them that the horse was built to appease Athena, but that it was built so large that the Trojans were deliberately prevented from bringing it into the city. This was the greatest blow to the Trojans' pride. If you bring this horse inside, the favor of the gods will pass to you. Imagine the atmosphere at that moment. Sinon feigns injuries to his body, tears his clothes, and waits in the most secluded corner of the beach. This is not just a game, but a life-or-death struggle. If the Trojans do not believe his lie, Sinon will be brutally murdered on that beach. Odysseus, looking into Sinon's eyes, knows the magnitude of the risk. But Sinon is determined. He is not just a spy, but the mental key that will unlock Troy's walls from within. As Odysseus and the kings retreat to their ships, Sinon is left all alone in the darkness. Feel this meditative and unsettling moment. The Achaean camp is being evacuated. Tents are being dismantled. Fires are being extinguished one by one. The beach, once echoing with the shouts of thousands of soldiers, now holds only the heartbeat of Sinon and the roar of the sea.
Behind him, the shadow of the colossal horse, before him, the dark sea. Sinon, in this silence, rehearses his lie one last time until dawn breaks and the first Trojan guards find him. This is the most convincing scene history has ever seen. A man's false tears will open the gates of a great city. Sinon, with his helpless stance on that shore, has become the sharpest weapon preparing the end of Troy. The stage is set. The only thing missing is for the Trojans to swallow this poisoned bait.
The most crucial point of the operation is the abandoned appearance of the coastline. Odysseus ordered that only ruined barracks, rotten piles of provisions, and a few old cloaks fluttering in the wind be left behind. When the Trojan scouts looked over the walls, they would see that the crowds of the siege they had grown accustomed to seeing for 10 years were gone. This is a psychological destruction operation. The sudden disappearance of an enemy does not create the euphoria of victory, but first a deep suspicion, then an unbridled curiosity. Sinon, huddled among the rocks where the shadow of the horse ends, waits for dawn. His task is to embellish this scene of abandonment with his own lie and persuade the Trojans to take this enormous gift inside. As the night progresses, the Achaean fleet falls into absolute silence behind Tenedos. Not a single light is lit on the ships. The soldiers, swords drawn, await that single signal of a torch rising on the horizon. On the shore, the colossal horse stands defiantly against the walls of Troy. This night is believed to mark the end of a decade-long nightmare for Troy, but the true apocalypse is silently knocking at the door. As dawn approaches, a layer of mist envelops the horse's hooves, making it appear as if it were a godlike being perched atop the clouds. When the guards on the walls of Troy see the empty shore in the morning light, they will not understand that they have been victims of the greatest deception in human history. They will simply say, "It's over." Yet everything was just beginning, with the silent waiting within that enormous wooden hall.
Close your eyes and imagine those first gray lights of dawn. For 10 years, every morning, the same scene. Thousands of ships, burning campfires, rising dust clouds, and the relentless roar of the Achaean army. But this morning, when the guards on the walls of Troy rubbed their eyes and looked down, they found only an endless void. That massive camp, those thousands of tents, that impregnable fleet seemed to have vanished into thin air overnight. The shore had returned to its pristine, silent state of 10 years ago. Only ashes scattered by the wind and the skeletons of a few ruined barracks remained. In the archive's The Great Delusion section, this moment is described as the greatest illusion a city could have for salvation. But the real operation was taking place just beyond the horizon. Agamemnon's massive fleet, rowing in absolute silence throughout the night, had reached the nearby island of Tenedos, Bozjata. Now the ships are hidden behind the island's steep cliffs and high hills, in those deep coves never visible from Troy. The soldiers are aboard, armored and swords drawn. No one is allowed to speak. The only sound is the rhythmic whisper of the waves crashing against the hulls of the ships. As Odysseus planned, the fleet will wait there like ghosts. They are no longer an army, but a hunter lurking in the darkness. From Troy, the Achaeans are no longer there. They are a tale of disappointment, having set sail for their homes, for the distant shores of Greece. Imagine the emptiness on the shore. For the Trojans, this emptiness is like the most beautiful music in the world. The heavy atmosphere on the walls dissipates. The pressure of a 10-year siege gives way to an indescribable lightness. The gates creak open for the first time in 10 years, and people rush towards the shore as if released from a prison.
But in the very center of that void, in the heart of the abandoned camp, rises only one thing: the enormous, majestic wooden horse. It gleams like gold in the morning sun, standing like a mysterious monument left behind by the fleeing enemy. As the Trojans gather around it, they try to understand whether it is a gift or a curse.
Feel this meditative moment. The Trojans walk along the shore, their feet trampling the marks of 10 years of war. Some find the tip of an Achaean spear, others a shattered shield. But all their eyes are on that enormous horse. Meanwhile, on the ships behind Tenedos, Odysseus gazes at the horizon, waiting for the smoke signal that will rise from Troy. While the city is buzzing with joy, a deathly silence reigns in the dark coves behind the island. While the Trojans think they are celebrating victory, the greatest ambush mechanism in history continues to operate like clockwork. The fleet is there, in ambush, waiting more resolutely than ever. When night falls, thousands of ships will reappear from that seemingly empty sea. But for now, there is only the sun, the deserted shore, and that silent, enormous horse. At Odysseus's signal, the 30 chosen warriors slipped into the secret chamber. As the last man entered, Epeios silently locked the inner latch. There was no turning back. 30 heavily armed men crouched shoulder to shoulder, knee to knee, in this narrow, dark wooden chamber. The air instantly warmed, filled with the heavy scent of freshly cut pine resin and the mingling breaths of the warriors. Every sound from outside, the howling of the wind, the waves of the sea, even the natural creaking of the wood, felt like thunder to those inside. Everyone knew the instruction: absolute silence. A single metal creak, a ring of armor striking a sword scabbard, or an uncontrolled cough could be their collective grave. The warriors tried to remain motionless, clinging to pieces of felt tucked between their armor. The darkness was so dense that no one could see their own hands. They could only feel the quickening heartbeats and labored breaths of their comrades beside them. Sweat dripped from beneath shields and breastplates onto the wooden floor, but no one raised to wipe it away.
The waiting phase of the operation had begun. Hours passed, the air inside dwindled, oxygen giving way to a heavy, damp carbon monoxide. Some warriors' muscles cramped from 10 years of exhaustion and the pressure of standing motionless in this confined space. But discipline had overcome physical pain. Odysseus, at the forefront of the group, pressed his ear against the wooden wall, listening to the world outside. He could hear the Trojans pouring onto the shore, the murmur of the crowd gathering around the horse, and the sound of the gates opening. The most critical moment for those inside was when the Trojans began examining the horse. The sharp thud as spears struck the horse's body hit each soldier inside like a blow to the heart. When someone plunged their spear into the horse's flank, even when the iron tip grazed the wood by millimeters, no one groaned. Everyone held their breath. Now there was only one truth. Either the Trojans would believe this enormous mass of wood and drag it into the city, or everything would end here, in this dark and airless void, in a bloody conclusion. The waiting had turned into the longest and quietest war history had ever seen. At dawn, silence reigned on the walls of Troy, but the city awoke at the cry of a guard. The enormous Achaean fleet that had covered the horizon for 10 years, the thousands of campfires, and the incessant noise of soldiers had vanished completely overnight. When King Priam and the city's elders climbed the walls, they could not believe their eyes. The shore, every inch of which they had drenched in blood for 10 years, was now shrouded in absolute silence. The Achaeans were gone. They had left behind only the ashes of extinguished fires, ruined barracks, and a deep void. The Trojans, initially hesitant, mistook the silence for a trap. But as hours passed and no movement was seen on the beach, 10 years of repression gave way to unbridled joy. The gates creaked open, and for the first time, the Trojans poured out of the walls without fear. Running along the beach, they shouted triumphant cries on the sands where Agamemnon and Achilles had once walked. But the crowd's attention soon fell on the enormous structure rising in the center of the abandoned camp in the middle of the beach. The colossal wooden horse stood in all its glory under the morning sun. The Trojans gathered around the horse, examining this silent giant. Some said it was a peace offering. Others believed it was an apology left to the gods by the fleeing enemy. The horse's massive body and proud stance both intrigued and thrilled the Trojans. For them, this horse was now a symbol of their 10 years of resistance and their ultimate victory. Meanwhile, life had stopped for the 30 warriors hidden inside the horse's belly. The shouts of victory from outside, the sound of curious hands tapping on the horse's body, and the arguments of the people echo within the narrow space of the wood. While the Trojans savor their triumph, they begin to debate whether or not to drag the enormous horse, which will be their sacrifice, into the city. The fate of the city is being woven around this mysterious pile of wood that stood in the middle of the shore that morning, a mixture of plea and ignorance. While Sinon's false tears and cleverly constructed story have captivated the vast majority of the crowd, a figure breaks through the throng, stopping everyone: Laocoon, the priest of Poseidon. Standing before the horse with a look of deep horror and doubt on his face, this man is Troy's last chance. Turning to the crowd, he cries his famous warning: "O wretched citizens, what madness! Do you really believe the enemy has retreated? Have you never known Ulysses, Odysseus? This horse is either a trap in which warriors are hidden or a siege machine built to breach our walls." Laocoon concludes his words with that shocking sentence that would go down in history: "Quid id est, timeo danatos et dona ferentes," meaning, "Whatever happens, I fear the Greeks who bring gifts." This instantly awakens suspicion in the hearts of the people. To put his warning into action, Laocoon hurls his heavy spear with great hatred at the horse's wooden body. The spear strikes the horse's belly precisely, trembling as it lodges in the wooden surface. At that moment, a deep, resonant groan echoes from the dark void within the horse. It is the sound of the armor of the 30 warriors inside clashing. If the Trojans had listened carefully at that moment, the course of history would have changed. But at that very moment, a terrifying event rising from the sea overturns all logic. The gods, especially Athena, who supports the Achaeans, must protect this deception. 2 gigantic serpents, coming from the direction of the island of Tenedos, cut through the waves and reach the shore. As the crowd fled in terror, these monstrous creatures pounced directly on Laocoon and his 2 sons. Before the eyes of the people, the priest and his sons perished in the suffocating coils of the snakes. For the Trojans, this was interpreted as a shocking divine sign. Laocoon had been punished by the gods for throwing a spear at the sacred offering.
No one could utter a single word that the horse was a trap. As Laocoon's lifeless body lay on the shore, the people, in great awe and fear, decided to bring the horse inside. Odysseus and his men inside followed this savagery from behind the wooden walls, only hearing the sounds. They maintained their deadly silence, and the last obstacle at the gates was gone. The Trojan people began to grab ropes to pull the enormous wooden giant, which would bring about their own demise, inside the city walls. As Laocoon's spear still trembled in the horse's belly, and the muffled metallic sound from within aroused suspicion, the sea suddenly began to foam. 2 enormous sea serpents, approaching from the direction of Tenedos, cleaved the waters and advanced towards the shore. This scene was like a nightmare erupting in the middle of a calm morning. The serpent's scaly bodies gleamed in the sunlight with blood-red and purple reflections. As the people recoiled in terror, these terrifying creatures pounced directly on the priest Laocoon and his 2 sons. In the archives, Holy Execution notes, this moment is described as the second when truth was silenced by a miracle. The serpents first coiled around the children, then began to strangle Laocoon, who rushed to their aid with their enormous coils. Laocoon cried out, trying to save his sons in his powerful arms, but no one heard him. The serpents not only killed them, but annihilated them in front of the people, as if in a sacrificial ritual. The creatures, having completed their task, swiftly returned to the sea and disappeared, gliding toward Athena's temple. For the people of Troy, this scene was an unquestionable divine sign. In their eyes, Laocoon was not a hero attempting to expose the Achaeans' deceit, but a sinner who laid his hands on a sacred offering, the wooden horse, presented to the goddess Athena. The last vestiges of doubt within the people gave way to absolute conviction with this horrific execution. The horse is sacred. Laocoon was punished by the gods for attacking it.
Odysseus and his companions, inside the horse's belly, listened with great tension to the screams outside, the hissing of the snakes, and the subsequent ominous silence. Laocoon's warning had been silenced by his own blood. Now only one voice rose outside. "Bring the horse inside! Take it to the temple!" The people of Troy, stepping over the corpse of the only man who tried to protect them, gathered around the enormous horse with ropes in their hands. Fate was sealed. The Trojans are preparing to embrace their own catastrophe as if it were a divine blessing. As the lifeless bodies of Laocoon and his sons lie on the sands of the beach, the heavy silence of terror that hung over the crowd gives way to a mystical resolve. Their gazes, no longer filled with fear, but with a sacred intoxication, as if witnessing a miracle, turn to the enormous wooden horse. At that moment, Priam, the aging but proud king of Troy, steps forward. This man, his white beard tossed by the wind, bearing the weariness of 10 years of suffering on his shoulders, is about to sign the death warrant of his own people and his lineage. Priam, gazing at the horse's carcass, speaks in a booming and unwavering voice. "You see, the gods themselves have descended among us and sealed the truth. Laocoon paid the price for laying his hands on a sacred gift. This horse is atonement sent to us from Olympus for our 10 years of suffering. The Achaeans fled the wrath of the goddess Athena and left this monument to her to atone for their sins. If this gift remains outside our walls, the wrath of the gods will remain upon us. But if we bring it inside, Troy will be blessed forever, and our enemies will never again pass through these gates." Imagine the silence in the horse's belly. Odysseus listens to every word of Priam, the honking of the pickaxes outside, and the joyful shouts of the people with an icy expression. The king's mercy and piety have become the sharpest sword of the Achaeans. The fate of Troy is sealed at that moment when a wise but blind king embraces the Trojan horse, which he considers a gift. The city's verdict is made. Death is invited into the heart of Troy with a magnificent ceremony, accompanied by flowers and songs. Priam, with his own hands, has lowered Troy's protective shield, preparing the city for the greatest ambush in history. The impenetrable walls of Troy, which had withstood all kinds of attacks, battering rams, and fire for 10 years, were witnessing the most tragic scene in history that morning. By the order of King Priam, the stone structures protecting the city began to be shaken, this time not from an enemy from outside, but by the city's own people. The majesty of the huge wooden horse exceeded the borders of Troy's famous western gate.
The statue was so large, so wide, that it was physically impossible for it to pass through the doorway. However, the mystical belief that blinded the Trojans turned architectural obstacles into details. Workers climbed the upper parts and side walls of the city wall with sledgehammers and levers in their hands. Those sacred stones, which had been defended with blood, sweat, and tears for 10 years, began to be removed with a great noise. The fall of each stone was an irreparable breach in Troy's protective shield. As clouds of dust rose into the air, the people saw this destruction not as a disaster, but as preparation for a sacred birth. A huge hole was opened in the walls. The city's immunity was sacrificed so that wooden giant could infiltrate. Greased planks were placed under the horses' wheels, and thousands of Trojans began to pull this silent beast inside by hanging from the huge ropes. As the horse advanced every inch through the gap, the remaining parts of the walls shook, as if the stones were warning of the approaching end. The statue paused 4 times as it passed through the walls. With every pause, the metallic ringing coming from the horse's belly and the sound of armor and weapons hitting each other echoed in the square. However, the people who sang victory songs, danced around the horse, and threw flowers on it, ignored this deadly warning, thinking it was part of the holiday noise.
When the horse finally entered the safety of the walls, right into the heart of the city, it left behind a collapsed wall and a defenseless city. The Trojans suffered not only a wooden statue, but also their own doom through the hole they opened with their own hands. For Odysseus and the warriors inside, this transition was the first concrete step to victory. With the collapse of the walls, Troy's legendary immunity ended, and the city became a defenseless victim waiting only for one night. After 10 years of siege, hunger, and the constant fear of death, Troy surrendered that night to the most uncontrolled and violent moment of relief in history. Thousands of torches were lit simultaneously in the streets, squares, and temple courts of the city. But these lights were lit not to celebrate a victory, but to hide the coming darkness. Everyone, from the king to the poorest people, wholeheartedly believed that the gods had finally ended this war, and the Achaeans were lost in the infinity of the sea. Old wine jars that had been stored for years were opened on huge tables set up in the squares. The wine flowed into the streets like a river. As the glasses were filled and emptied, 10 years of mourning was replaced by vicious joy. The warriors had thrown aside their shields and spears, taken off their armor, and were simply caught up in the rhythm of the fun. Hymns and victory songs mingled in the streets, and young people were dancing around the horse with wreaths of flowers. Troy thought it was truly breathing for the first time in 10 years. However, every breath was a part of the end that awaited them.
The wooden horse, rising in the shadow of the temple of Pallas Athena in the center of the city, stood like a silent and proud giant in the middle of this noisy revelry. As the flickering light of the torches hit the horse's smooth body, the wood glistened like living skin. The louder the festival outside, the deeper the silence in the horse's belly. The 30 warriors inside were listening to the laughter coming from outside, the sounds of clinking glasses, and eventually the speeches that became heavy and slurred under the influence of the wine. In the darkness, Odysseus placed his hand on the hilt of his sword, waiting for this collective drunkenness of the city to reach its deepest point. As the night progressed, the songs became less frequent. The torches went out one by one and were replaced by a heavy, drunken sleep. Troy had lost its greatest defense, its alertness. Even the guards had slipped into the towers, and the famous attention on the walls had been dispersed. When the city fell into deep silence, like a defenseless victim ready for the greatest raid in history, only the wind could be heard passing through the collapsed walls.
There was no longer a king, a hero, or a wall. All that remained was a city oozing with wine and a deadly patience hiding in its heart.
The darkest hour of the night had fallen over Troy like a heavy blanket. The triumphant songs that had echoed through the streets just hours earlier had faded, and the wine-addicted people and guards had been swept away into a deep, breathless sleep. The only sounds in the city were the last crackling of dying torches and the whistling of the wind through the breaches in the ruined walls. In the square in front of the temple of Pallas Athena, the enormous horse stood tall in the moonlight like a silvery tombstone. In the narrow, airless space beneath the horse's belly, 30 warriors had waited for hours, their muscles motionless. Time for them was measured not by the festivities outside, but by their own heartbeats. Odysseus pressed his ear against the wooden frame and listened to the world outside. There was neither footsteps nor a guard's warning. Only the rhythm of a city's defenseless slumber could be heard. He knew the moment had arrived. In the darkness, in a voice even quieter than a whisper, he gave his command. Now, silently. Epeos meticulously turned the latch of the hidden mechanism in the horse's belly. The hinges, previously oiled to prevent even the slightest creak from the friction of wood against wood, opened almost silently. The cool night air from outside began to fill the dark void. This fresh breath was the first scent of victory for the warriors inside, a victory that had come at the end of 10 years. The darkest hour of the night had fallen over Troy like a heavy blanket. The triumphant songs that had echoed through the streets just hours earlier had faded, and the wine-addicted people and guards had been swept away into a deep, breathless sleep. The only sounds in the city were the last crackling of dying torches and the whistling of the wind through the breaches in the ruined walls. In the square in front of the temple of Pallas Athena, the enormous horse stood tall in the moonlight like a silvery tombstone. In the narrow, airless space beneath the horse's belly, 30 warriors had waited for hours, their muscles motionless. Time for them was measured not by the festivities outside, but by their own heartbeats. Odysseus pressed his ear against the wooden frame and listened to the world outside. There was neither footsteps nor a guard's warning. Only the rhythm of a city's defenseless slumber could be heard. He knew the moment had arrived. In the darkness, in a voice even quieter than a whisper, he gave his command. Now, silently. Epeos meticulously turned the latch of the hidden mechanism in the horse's belly. The hinges, previously oiled to prevent even the slightest creak from the friction of wood against wood, opened almost silently. The cool night air from outside began to fill the dark void. This fresh breath was the first scent of victory for the warriors inside, a victory that had come at the end of 10 years. Under Odysseus's leadership, the warriors, their sharp daggers drawn from their scabbards and their silent silk rope ladders, began to slip out one by one. When their feet touched the stone floor of Troy, they moved like ghosts. This once impregnable city was now about to be conquered from within. As the warriors moved toward the city gates, blending into the shadows of the darkness, Odysseus signaled to Sinon, who was hiding behind the horse. Now it was time to shine that deadly light on the great fleet lying in ambush behind Tenedos. 30 warriors, moving like shadows under the moonlight, spread silently from the center of Troy toward the walls. They passed silently among the Trojans, who lay slumped in the streets, on the temple thresholds and by the fountains, their armor bound with rags. The city was caught at its most vulnerable moment by the greatest betrayal in history. The main group, led by Odysseus, headed directly to the city's main gates. The few guards who were dozing in the gate towers or passed out from the weight of wine were neutralized in the darkness before they could even understand what was happening. The bolts of those massive bronze gates, which had withstood battering rams, colossal siege towers, and the charge of thousands of soldiers for 10 years, were now silently pulled from within by Achaean hands. The heavy hinges opened with a deep groan, heralding the changing fate of Troy. At the same moment, Sinon, waiting in the dark corner of the shore, waved his torch 3 times toward the sky. This was the awaited signal for the vast fleet lying in ambush in the dark coves behind the island of Tenedos. Suddenly, hundreds of tiny lights appeared on the horizon. The Achaean ships, their sails unfurled and oarsmen pulling with all their might, began to pour towards the shore like a flood. Thousands of soldiers, carrying the rage and ambition of 10 years, were silently but resolutely returning to the shores of Troy from the darkness.
As the ships struck the sandy shore, the soldiers silently leaped out and rushed towards the open gates. Troy no longer had impenetrable walls or protective gods. The city was squeezed between the massive army outside and the elite warriors inside, like an anvil and hammer. With the opening of the gates, the dam of the 10-year siege burst, and the Achaean army poured into the sleeping streets of Troy like a catastrophe. The pitch-black darkness of night began to transform into the bloodiest crimson hue in history just before dawn. Troy's famous silence gave way to a deep roar as thousands of Achaean soldiers swarmed through the city gates. The first blow was struck at the guards at the city's most strategic points. They were annihilated in the darkness without a single cry. But the real apocalypse began when the first torch was thrown onto the roof of a wooden house. Flames instantly rose, engulfing the Trojan skies, unshaken for 10 years, in a terrifying light. As the flames spread rapidly, the city streets became corridors of fire. Awakened from their sleep by the weight of wine and the cries from outside, the Trojans found themselves in the midst of a nightmare. Men, half naked, unarmed, and terrified, rushed out of their homes to confront the merciless enemy they had fought on the battlefields for 10 years, but this time it had entered their very houses. The 10 years of pent-up anger of the Achaeans was unleashed as a torrent of hatred with every swing of the swords and every thrust of the spears. This was no longer a pitched battle. It was a night of execution, where an entire city was burned alive and put to the sword.
In the narrow streets of the city, blood was flowing through the stones, mixing with the rivers of wine that had just flown. Those unshakable walls, which had withstood all kinds of attacks for 10 years, resisted the anger of Achilles and the armies of Agamemnon, were now being heated by the fires lit from inside, and screams were rising from every corner. The cries of mothers to protect their children, the deep sounds of iron hitting bone, and the noise of collapsing roofs turned into Troy's funeral march. The corridors of the palace, the courtyards of the sacred temples, and the squares of the city were now slaughterhouses where only death reigned. In the palace of King Priam, the tragedy reached its peak. The old king, who protected his people with the compassion of a father for 10 years, understood from the sound of swords echoing in the corridors of his palace what kind of monster the wooden horse he had taken in with his own hands had turned into. While young Neoptolemus was tearing down the doors of the palace to finish the work left unfinished by his father Achilles, Troy's noble lineage was being buried in the dusty pages of history overnight. Sacred temples were being plundered, golden statues were toppled, and the pure white marble of the Temple of Athena was stained with the blood of defenseless people.
When the sun began to rise over Troy from behind Mount Ida, there was no longer a city left. Only black smoke was rising from those huge towers that had been standing for 10 years. Overnight, one of the world's most magnificent civilizations was reduced to ashes. The walls were in place, but the spirit within them had withdrawn.
The doors were open, but there was no one left to live inside. The fall of Troy was not just a military victory, it was the end of an era. At dawn, as the wind blew the ashes of the burning city into the waters of the Aegean, only the blackened skeleton of that huge wooden horse that history would never forget and the silence of the extinction of a people remained. As the sun rose slowly over the Aegean Sea, its lights illuminated not a shining city as it had for 10 years, but masses of smoke rising into the sky like huge black columns. Troy, the most magnificent and durable city ever seen in history, was now just a pile of memories and ashes. The Achaean ships lined up along the coast were filled not with disappointment this time, but with Troy's treasures and captured nobles. As Menelaus held the hand of Helen, whom he lost 10 years ago, and led her towards the docks of the burning city, the destruction around him was whispering about how heavy the price of this reunion was.
Odysseus stood on the hill where Troy's impenetrable walls once stood, where now only sooty stones remained. His gaze fell on the huge wooden horse in the city square, half burnt and its body riddled with spears. This victory did not come with Achilles' invincible sword, Agamemnon's thousands of ships, or the brutal power of the armies. This victory was born in a dark room in one man's mind, was patiently crafted, and wore the armor of a lie, collapsing an entire empire from within. Odysseus engraved this truth in human history. Even the highest walls were as weak as a paper shield against a well-constructed thought. He had gained intelligence, not strength, but the price of this intelligence was the complete erasure of an ancient civilization. As he looked around, he felt that the taste of victory was not as sweet as he thought. While the rest of the Achaean army boarded their ships with the gold they had plundered and shouts of victory, the silent anger of the gods echoed in Odysseus's mind. The sacred temples of Troy were plundered, and the altars were dirty with blood. While creating this plan, he violated not only the city, but also the protection of the gods. He whispered to himself, "This war is over, but this victory would have atonement." He felt the gaze of Pallas Athena and Poseidon, the ruler of the seas, on his neck. He had been away from home, his wife Penelope, and his son Telemachus for 10 years, but now he realized that reaching the olive trees of Ithaca would be much more difficult than opening the gates of Troy.
When Odysseus stepped on the board of his ship, the smoke rising from Troy covered the horizon. While other kings were sailing away in the drunkenness of victory, he was looking at the eerie waves of the seas. The wind rising over the ashes of Troy was telling him that a new and much longer journey had begun. After 10 years of war, the famous 10-year struggle to return home, the Odyssey, began at that very moment, in the shadow of a burning city. Troy had fallen, Helen had been rescued, and history had been made for the Achaean army. But the real test for Odysseus was waiting in those vast seas that would once again test the limits of his own intelligence and will.